Hi, everybody, and welcome. Today is going to be our very first day of remote learning. It's Tuesday, November 17th, and here's our plan for the day. Today, for my class, your only responsibility is, aside from logging into Zoom, is to watch the video and then answer the questions that pop up on the right side of the screen. There will be 7 total questions, and they will be worth 2 points each. When I put them in the gradebook, you will find them for 14 points under the name World War I Introduction. So if you have any questions about that or the grade in the gradebook, that's what you can refer to it as. Also, you can always email me during remote learning. I'll be available, and I should be able to respond to your questions really quickly. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be starting our new unit on World War I. It's one of my favorite units that we talk about. I like the First World War, not because it's a war, but because I feel like it has a lot of good lessons to learn, and I feel like it reveals a lot about humanity, and I find that really, really fascinating. So let's kind of think about what we know about World War I. Do you know anything? Go ahead and challenge yourself. Think, what do you know about the First World War? Maybe you're an expert and like to watch videos in your free time, or maybe you don't know anything yet, and that's okay. Okay, so thinking over. Hopefully that didn't hurt your brain too much. We've had one day off of school already, after all. So, did any of your ideas involve this guy? Yep, that's a picture of Adolf Hitler. So, for some of you, he might look pretty familiar. While Adolf Hitler is involved in the First World War, it's definitely not in a major way, and he's only actually a common foot soldier for the German army. But it is worth noting that he does get to wear a lot of pretty fabulous hats. Hitler, on the other hand, does not become a big, evil, megalomaniac leader that we commonly think about when we think about Hitler until the Second World War. So we're going to save him for later. Don't worry, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about him. Instead, let's talk about what the World War I actually means. It's known by 2 names. The first is the Great War, and the second one is the War to End All Wars. I find both of these names pretty fascinating. One, the Great War is a complex name all in itself. It kind of makes it seem like war itself is a great thing, and for a lot of people at the time, especially war hawks, they went into the First World War seeing as a great opportunity. They were looking for honor, they were looking for glory, they were trying to display courage. And so the chance at a big major war was going to be the chance to do that. Their attitudes very quickly changed because the fighting during World War I is some of the gruesomest that we've seen yet. Another name is the War to End All Wars. People truly believed that this fighting, which was so gigantic and catastrophic, truly was going to stop wars for the rest of history forever. We know that this is not necessarily true because obviously there's a Second World War and a lot of other wars that follow. So the War to End All Wars was not entirely successful, but it still is the owner of this pretty unique name. The death count for World War I is actually staggeringly high. There are 37 million people that died during World War I. 16 million of these were casualties of fighting. The other 21 million would be resulted from wounds that wouldn't heal or for people that lived in nearby towns and were heavily impacted by World War I. We're going to see some pretty insane weapons that are used during the First World War, and so that'll kind of explain why the death count was just so high. We don't even see a death count this high for World War II, and there's a whole lot of catastrophes that happened during that war. Take a look at this chart. I find this actually very fascinating. It talks about the percentage of mobilized World War I forces that became casualties by country. This shows you the number of World War I soldiers that died by country that were involved in the fighting. If you look in the Allied powers, the second one down is the United States. Only 8% of all fighting soldiers from World War I from the United States died. That's a pretty small percentage, but it can be explained by the fact that the United States was not involved in World War I until the very last year and a half of the war. So 8% makes sense. If we look at the Central Powers category, on the other hand, which is the other side of the war, and we look at the very bottom, Austria-Hungary sees some pretty extreme rates of death for the soldiers that were actively fighting. 90%, that's insane. That means that only 10% of soldiers from that country returned home. That's pretty impactful if you think about it. Let's look at the countries that were involved. This map is really colorful, and it should be, because there were a lot of countries that were actively involved in the fighting of the First World War. Now, some of these countries were not owned by their own governments quite yet, but were colonies that were owned by big key players of the First World War. There's not a lot of space left on the globe for places that were not impacted by World War I. And there's a lot of players in World War I that don't necessarily get as much notice as maybe they should. We'll jump into what countries are involved in World War I and the allies and how those are set up later. But today we're going to focus on the main tidbits of the First World War and start trying to wrap our head around what this big major conflict actually looks like. The next thing I want to talk about is the amount of money that's spent on the First World War. $208 billion total dollars. Now, $208 billion is an incredibly large number, and that's kind of hard for us to wrap our head around. I know that I definitely won't see $208 billion in my lifetime. So what could this actually look like? Well, first, $208 billion explains the fact that lots of countries had to sell war bonds, which is essentially selling a piece of paper that pays the government for the war. So a lot of people had to participate in paying for the First World War. But let's try to get our head around $208 billion a little bit. I did some number crunching, and I found that $208 billion can buy you 35 billion Big Mac meals. Okay, so 35 billion is still an incredibly large number. So what does this mean? 35 billion Big Mac meals means that we could buy every single American breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so 3 meals a day, for over 97,000 years. So that's a lot of Big Macs, but it's also a lot of money. And we're spending this to pay for soldiers, for weapons, for machinery, and for the clothing that would be going towards the war. Now, this is not just any one country. This is all countries combined. But the amount of money spent on war was pretty extreme. This also shows you why big businesses that were selling products for the war, they made out like bandits at the end of the First World War. Here comes my very first question, and it's going to be a little bit of a review. What I want you to tell me is which of the following names are names that are associated with the First World War. So what other names is World War I known by? The next thing we're going to talk about are the potential causes for World War I. Lots of historians argue that there are 4 main causes for why World War I started. MAIN is an acronym for these four causes. So the first one is M for militarism. The second one is A for alliance systems. The third one is I for imperialism, and that should be a review. And the fourth one is N for nationalism. We're going to dig into what each one of these 4 different terms means and how they're related to the First World War. We're going to keep coming back to these, so we should be very familiar with them. The first one is militarism. Militarism is the desire to build the nation's military competitively with other nations. We can kind of imagine this as like a bodybuilder who wants to put on the most muscles. That way he can outflex other people at the gym. Nations who are exhibiting signs of militarism are going to be countries that spend lots and lots of money on their military. They're also going to have a lot of people in their country actively involved in the military. These militaristic countries are also going to be countries that think that using the military is going to be a solution for their country's problems. So if a problem arises, one of their first things is going to be to show off some of their weapons and maybe even put those weapons to use by going to war against another country. Some examples of militarism would be during World War I, we started developing tanks because we knew that tanks would outdo other nations. We knew that we could use tanks to overpower other countries and to overpower the weapons that they were using. Another example of militarism would be North Korea. They like to show off their nuclear weapons and their nuclear forces, and they often like to threaten that they're going to use their military forces against other countries, sometimes even the United States, although this hasn't happened successfully yet, so I don't think we have too much to worry about. Another example of militarism would be the Germans. Before World War I, the Germans created something called a U-boat. These U-boats were submarines that could be used to sink ships. And these Germans used these submarines in pretty sneaky ways, and they actually get themselves into quite a bit of trouble. These U-boats eventually helped to bring the United States into the war against Germany. And when the United States joins the war, Germany starts to not stand a chance. So we're going to see these U-boats get them into quite a bit of trouble. Our next question is, which of the following is the best definition for militarism? The next term that we're going to talk about is alliance systems. Alliance systems is an agreement made by two or more countries who are going to agree to fight for each other's side if they decide to go to war. Now, sometimes this fighting can look like sending a bunch of soldiers to help, but other times alliances can be that we just send money to help pay for the war. Maybe we send goods to help the countries fight the war. Maybe we send money, or maybe we send forms of transportation that that country can use during a time of war. During World War I, we're going to see the United States exhibit all of these different alliance traits because we're going to be helping our allies, which are France, Russia, and Great Britain. The Central Powers on the other side of the war contain Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy for a while, and Turkey. Let's take a look at these alliance systems, but on a broader scale. Take a look at this map. We will see that the allies, who the United States paired up with, are covering an insane amount of the map. We can see that the Central Powers, who were our enemies during the First World War, are covering the orange sections of the map. This again shows us just how broad the First World War was, and it covers a lot of the planet. This brings us to our next question. Which of the following is the best definition for the term alliances? Imperialism should be a good review for us, seeing as our last is all about imperialism and these big, strong countries that took over smaller, weaker countries. That way we could use their natural resources or take advantage of ports or military bases that we could place in these areas. Some examples of imperialism include when Great Britain took over India. That way we could have access to the spice trade. When the United States took over Hawaii so we could grow sugarcane and have access to pineapple plantations. And then when basically all of Europe cut up Africa like a gigantic cake so that they could take the slices that they wanted and use the resources that were found in a very resource-rich Africa. Let's review very quickly. Which of the following is the best definition for the term imperialism? The very last letter in the acronym MAIN is nationalism. Now, this one can be kind of hard to understand because sometimes nationalism can seem like a very positive thing, and sometimes nationalism can be taken too far and turn into something not so good. Nationalism is extreme pride for one's country, and sometimes it encourages people to go to pretty far extremes to uphold their nation's values. So some positives of nationalism would be like a lot of people turning up to go and vote for an election, or a country coming together to help other members of that country in a time of need. An example of this would be when Americans came together to help aid the victims of Hurricane Katrina. Some of us might remember lots of people flying down to the southern United States to help these people whose homes had been destroyed by the hurricanes. A not so good example of nationalism would be when the Germans started developing a very large and strong country that was based around the idea that Germans were superior to anyone else. Because of the superiority complex, they believed that they needed to eliminate Jews from society. And so this resulted in the Holocaust. So that would be an extreme negative version of what nationalism could possibly look like. Nationalism draws a lot of countries into the First World War, and we're going to see this take place. Because this is a time when imperialism is running rampant and a lot of smaller countries are overtaken by these larger and stronger countries, these smaller countries are going to start fighting back because they're proud of their nation and they want the chance to vote and elect their own leaders. So, because they're going to rebel, a lot of these strong countries are going to have to show up with their military power to maintain that control. What I want you to tell me is, which of the following is the best definition for nationalism? Now I want us to look at a couple maps. This is what the Europe looks like before World War I. It looks pretty different than how Europe looks today, although there's still some pretty decent similarities. But Europe was going to see a huge transformation during the First World War. Country lines are going to be redrawn, new countries are going to be added. And there's an old saying where a father was telling his young boy at the beginning of the First World War, while the young boy was studying maps in school, that he shouldn't study the way that the maps looked until the end of the First World War, because the world was going to look like a very different place. And this was definitely true. Take a look at these two maps. The top one is the map we just looked at, and the bottom map is going to be the new countries that were established at the end of the First World War. See a lot of new countries? See some countries that don't exist anymore? These are some pretty big differences, and the countries were definitely redrawn as a result of the First World War. We can also see a lot of countries that popped up at the end of World War I, and that's because they gained their independence from larger empires like the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We'll explain some more of that later, but keep this in mind that World War I was so large and so impactful that it changed the way the world looked forever. Before we go, I have one more thing that I want us to look at, and it's this quote. I'll go ahead and read it out loud for you. And then your question is, I want you to tell me what you think this quote possibly means. So we're going to use some more historical skills to interpret this quote. It says, all the horrors of all the ages were brought together. Not only the armies, but whole populations were thrown into the middle of them. And this is by Winston Churchill. So what do you think that this quote means?